Hi, I'm Kurt Vetters. I really appreciate you taking some time to listen today. Um, I am from the Shoals area. Was born in the village back in '61. Dad ended up getting a job with NASA and we moved away at 5. But I've always been connected to this area and just love the Shoals. And Wood Avenue, where we are now, has always been a dream of mine to live on Wood. My grandparents lived on McBurney, north of Florence, and I just drove by these houses and now we're in one, so it's just quite exciting. So I thought I'd take a minute and share a story that I found at a genealogy library in Fort Wayne, Indiana, about how my people got here. And I think it's interesting because chances are, if you're watching this, your people got here the same way. So I always ate barbecue at Singleton's Barbecue. It was my favorite barbecue place. So I always called it my desert island food. If I had one thing to eat forever, it'd be Singleton's Barbecue. And I had reason to go to Newbern, North Carolina, right on the coast, and found out that the barbecue in Newbern was exactly the same kind of barbecue and slaw they served at Singleton's. Well, that made me curious if there was a connection. So I'm researching some family history in Indiana and come across a diary of a woman who was an indentured servant in Newbern, North Carolina at the beginning of the 1800s. She got her freedom along with a bunch of other people. Names like Olive and Cheatham are all interconnected. Davis, all these people, they took their houses apart. They built wagons out of them. They drove the wagons to the Tennessee River, took the same wood and turned them into boats. They floated down the Tennessee River basically to the end of navigation. Jackson had just pushed the Indians out, and this is where they settled. They landed at Muscle Shoals, turned those boats back into wagons, and of course they rolled south and ended up on Jackson Mountain west of Tuscumbia. And that's where my roots have been for close to 200 years now. So when we moved back to Florence, we found this house on Wood Avenue. And as we walk up on it, there's a plaque on the front door that says the Negli Bain House. And that got me intrigued because I'm a history guy and we're on the Jackson Highway, which Andrew Jackson cut to basically to move his army down to New Orleans. And I'm convinced that this is probably built to some degree on an Indian trail or a game trail. That tends to be how they built roads back in the day. So here I am in a historic 120-year-old home, and I'm on a 200-year-old road. I'm all in trying to learn about the Negli family. Well, I'm an author, and I write Civil War novels. And the novel that I just finished before I got down here, Freedom Spring, is this book. It's about African Americans in the Civil War. A lot of that book takes place in Nashville at an amazing place called Fort Negli, named for a Civil War general, James Negli, who was, incidentally, the first Union general to occupy Florence in 1862. And that's quite a coincidence that I've just written and studied, and actually my books are for sale at the Fort Negli Park, and I'm living in the Negli house. So that's what started this research and this connection. So here's the story. So 1862, early days of the Civil War, Florence is still in good shape at that point. We've not been occupied and reoccupied and abandoned and fought over. In 1862, it's still pretty pristine. And General Negli brings troops down to Rogersville, takes the ford down there, decides he's going to move west and enter Florence and capture Florence. Head of navigation, kind of the break of the Tennessee River. So he moves into town, and I don't know this, but I'm convinced that I'm right. So I'm still researching this. His brother, younger brother, was a guy named Albert. And I'm pretty convinced Albert was on his staff, which was not uncommon those days. A Civil War general would have his cousins or brothers on his staff. And I'm convinced in 1862 the Negli family saw Florence and fell in love with it. That's what I think happened. So fast forward, the war ends, they go back to Pennsylvania, and then the brother, Albert, comes back to Florence, moves his family, becomes the city engineer, becomes the postmaster, raises his family here, and his son Charles is the guy that founds the Negli Hotel, which is built at the corner of Tennessee and Court Street and burned. And that's how the Negli family has me, who wrote about the Negli, Fort Negli, and is intertwined in that, came to be in this space. So I'm a history guy, and the transition to becoming a writer from being just someone interested in history was an interesting process because it's not my day job. I have another job. But I was watching my kids growing up and not really being interested in history at all. And I found that the books that were out there, in my opinion, on history were old. They were written in 1900 or 1905, and they just didn't have the language that connected with kids today. And so I had a story of my ancestor, William Sweeney, who the family stories were that at the age of 14, he got drafted at the end of the war into the Confederate Army, went to the Battle of Nashville, or Battle of Franklin, and came back home in rags. And the other family story was that his father fought for the Union, which was not uncommon. This was a very divided area. And so from that, I came up with the book Confederate Winter. So where did I get my knowledge to write a book that would resonate with young people today? It's because I was an Army officer. So my career at Alabama was really designed to go into the Army and to be an Army officer. And the National Guard unit that I was in, we ran tanks one weekend out of Aniana, and the next weekend we did Civil War reenacting. So the same men I was in tanks with on one weekend, the next weekend we were out at a reenactment somewhere doing Confederate and Union reenacting, and it immersed me in that subject. And so I was able then to kind of take that language of soldiers, I never saw combat, but I spent 300 nights a year sleeping out in the woods, on a tank, in the field, living the life. I know what soldiers think, I know what they do, and I felt like I could put that in a book. So that's where Confederate Winter came from, and the goal with that was to try to introduce young people that there is some fascinating stories in history that are worth reading. So the way the publishing world works now is you can go to traditional publishers or you can self-publish. I'm a salesman. I decided to self-publish. I had a feeling I knew where my audience was. So I went through that process, got the book out. My launch date was set, and it happened to coincide the exact same week of the Charleston shooting. And all of a sudden, the world changed. My book, Confederate Winter, has the word Confederate in it. Now, it's a story that's very reconciliatory. His father fought for the North. A lot of it is about the brother versus brother, son versus father aspect. It's not political. But I was banned on Amazon for a week. So in my first week, I was a banned book author. Now, since then, they put it back up. I actually do quite well on Amazon, but it was eye-opening to see the power that the Amazons of the world have in changing the narrative. So you get on the speaking engagement, and I did a lot of book talks, and I got to meet new fellow authors and really fascinating people. And one of the people I met was a lady named Peggy Towns from Athens, Decatur area. And she's got a book. She spoke after me at a book talk in Florence, actually. Her book is called Duty Driven. And as I was writing these stories about my ancestors in the Civil War, she was doing the same. Now, she's African American, and her ancestors were in bondage. And I learned the story about her ancestor that left bondage, joined the United States Army, called the USCT, United States Colored Troops, and fought for the Union. 180,000 fought. Now, most of us know the story Glory, but what I learned was that there's much, much more and very robust stories. Well, I'm a novelist. She's a historian. I'm a novelist. So what my job is with Confederate Winter and Freedom Spring, my next book, is to try to tell you how it felt to live in that time. Now, a historian is going to tell you what happened. Now, my job is to get in your head and give you the feeling, and my real job is to get young people involved so that they then begin to want to become interested in history. I'm Johnny Appleseed. I'm planting seeds. So Freedom Spring was the next book, and it was quite a departure for me because it was a chapter of American history, the African American experience in the Civil War as a soldier, that opened my eyes to the incredible, fruitful nature of the story and how many stories there were. And I'll give you some examples of the serendipity nature of this. So my book starts in Florence. It moves up to Nashville. Fort Negley figures prominently, which we talked about with the Negli family. Interesting serendipity there. And then my book moves to Fort Blakely down in Mobile. My brother-in-law happens to live on the battlefield of Fort Blakely, which on the last day of the Civil War was the largest charge of African American soldiers in the war. And it was a successful charge. We found literally a cannon fragment in their front yard with a metal detector, who was my friend Barry Swope down in Mobile is a very well-respected metal detectorist down there, and he and I played football together in high school. What are the odds? So all that got rolled up into Freedom Spring, and I think I've done it justice, giving you an idea of what it felt like to be an African American soldier. One day you're in bondage, and the next day you're carrying a gun and learning how to fight for your country. So we've moved out to the front porch. My apologies for the car and traffic noise and the wind, but it's a beautiful day, and this is such an intersection of history here, with a 200-year-old road and Wood Avenue, which used to be Market. So much happened here, the murder of Judge McClure, and so as I think about the next books I'm going to write, it's just a fantastic place to live. So I want to close the conversation with you with this. Most people, I think, that are Civil War buffs that have been fascinated with that time period are like me. We're white guys that were born in the time when the 100th anniversary of the Civil War was going on. We grew up with the Bruce Catton books and Shelby Foote, and that's what we're interested in. And what I'm telling you is, if Freedom Spring is a gateway book for you and your grandkids and your kids, as is Confederate Winter, but they're gateway books to get you interested in a brand new perspective of the Civil War. Reconstruction did a lot of things, but one thing it did was it squelched the local communities' understanding of the fact that the African American soldiers fought. Now, they're U.S. soldiers, and so their stories were suppressed. I've read some horrible stories of what happened to those the NCOs and soldiers that came out of the USCT that moved back in their communities. They just did not get to tell their stories. My point with this is, I think we have a duty with books like this to get them in the schools, to get them out to people that can plant the seeds of history with our young people. I don't think you do it by reading nonfiction, by dry books. I think you have to tell them stories. They have to get interested in the fact that there's a rich heritage there. So I think it's inherent upon our generations that have kind of grown up fascinated with the Civil War to find ways to pass that gene on the future generations. And my humble opinion, you do it with stories, and that's what I've done, is create stories with Freedom Spring and Confederate Winter. So my hope is that people will buy them, but I don't want you to keep them. I want you to give them away to kids. Buy some for your local elementary school. They're perfect reading for 10 to 15-year-old. Now, a lot of adults read them too, but I wrote them specifically for young adults. And so that's what I hope, that the Civil War buffs like me will see these books out into the community, and they'll begin to get some people interested in this, what I consider the most fascinating time in American history. It's such a watershed moment. So much devolves from it. There's such a rich and a vein of pride for everybody in it. We just have to get the young people interested in understanding that normal people in everyday lives had to deal with things that were completely beyond their control and do the best they could. Florence was a perfect example of that, because it changed hands so many times. So where do you get the book? I consider, if you're in the Shoals area, Pope's Tavern, Medford Jewelers are places that really support me. The Visitor Center usually carries the book. I have it at the library, but you can get it on Amazon. I do pretty well there. At Fort Negli up in Nashville and at the Franklin Battlefield stores, they're big supporters of mine. But the bottom line is, the book is accessible. You can find it. And don't just get it for you. Get it for those young people in your life that you want to plant the bug of history.